Go.
Good evening. On behalf of everyone at Books and Books, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's evening with Marisel Vera, where she'll be discussing her new book, The Taste of Sugar. This event is presented in partnership with our friends at Miami Book Fair, Lit Hub, and Culture Crusaders. A proud Boricua, Marisel Vera is the author of If I Bring You Roses and the two-time winner of Willow Review's Fiction Prize. She lives in Chicago and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. To moderate tonight's conversation, we have the wonderful Tayari Jones. Tayari Jones is the author of 4 novels, most recently An American Marriage, which was the recipient of many accolades, including the winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction and an Oprah's Book Club selection. Jones, a member of the Fellowship of Southern Writers, has also been a recipient of the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, among other awards. She is a graduate of Spelman College, University of Iowa, and Arizona State University. Before we start the program, I'd like to remind you that you can purchase The Taste of Sugar by clicking the button below the screen. Then we'll bring Tayari on screen for the conversation, and we'll take some questions from the audience. So please feel free to ask away by using the Ask Question button on the bottom of the screen. And now, without further ado, let's welcome our authors.
Hi, Marisel, it's so wonderful to see you. Congratulations on your new book.
Thank
Congratulations on The Taste of Sugar.
Thank you.
How do you feel? How do you feel?
Excited and grateful. Very grateful.
When I woke up this morning, I saw that you got a rave review in the Washington Post. I don't even think rave is strong enough of a word for what happened to you in the Washington Post. The lead book critic says that this is a thrilling novel about Puerto Rican history through the eyes of a passionate love story.
Thank you. I was excited too. I have to confess that I don't really know much about critics because I'm one of those writers where I just stay in my little office and I write. And everybody was telling me everyone was really excited. So I'm very grateful for that.
Well, I was really thrilled to see because I read an early copy of the book and I knew right away that it was something special. And I'm happy to see the way that it is landing in the world. Before we start, because the book just was published last Tuesday, I imagine a lot of people don't know yet exactly what this book is about. Would you just tell us a little bit about it?
Well, it's about a family in Puerto Rico right before and after the Spanish-American War. A young couple, a coffee growing family, just trying to raise their kids and just live like everyone wants to. And all the circumstances that happen in the world that they're not aware of that just totally changes their lives and makes them make these very difficult choices to leave Puerto Rico and to go to Hawaii and work in the sugarcane plantation.
I mean, I don't know if I agree that they're just an ordinary family trying to raise their kids. I mean, the love story between them is very exciting. She is a young woman from a kind of more upwardly mobile family, and she falls for a coffee farmer. And, you know, she reads French novels. She has this idea of the romance of what married life would be. And it turns out not to be anything like she thought.
That's right, right. But I thought that was could be true for a girl of her time. 18 years old and her head is in the clouds and she thinks that she's going to be rescued from a very boring life by this handsome person and she takes a chance. And I think that also shows a lot about her character. She's a woman, a young woman who will take chances. And this is the first big chance that she took. And
it was a big one. It was
a big one. Yeah.
And I think part of that shows, even though this book is set in what, like 1890s?
Yes, 1890s. Yes.
But some parts of it just felt so like it could have happened yesterday. The idea that when she meets her mother-in-law does not like her. Like that is an age-old conundrum.
Right. Her mother-in-law does not like her.
Well, I liked her and her mother-in-law both. And I hope we'll get to talk about the mother-in-law because she was one of the most fascinating characters in the novel. But before we go any further, would you be willing to read to us just so we can get a feel for the book?
Yes, I would love to. I want to read this one chapter, chapter 28, The Hurricane, because you'll there are at least 6 of the characters that I write about in this section. So you'll get
Well,
to know.
before, tell us a little, set it up a little bit. Tell us, when was this hurricane? What was this hurricane?
This hurricane is San Ciriaco, and it hit Puerto Rico in 1899, just a year after the U.S. invasion of Puerto Rico. The U.S. invaded Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, and they basically set up military occupation of the island. So this hurricane happens when they've occupied the island for a year, and it hits most of Puerto Rico, very similar to Hurricane Maria in 2017, but especially in Utuado, coffee country, where Valentina and Vicente have their coffee farm. So they don't know what's going to happen at this point, only that the hurricane is coming. Chapter 28, The Hurricane. It was difficult to sleep in the terrible heat of the first days of August 1899. There was something unusual about the air that escaped Valentina's notice, but filled Vicente with a sense of foreboding. Up on the mountain, he smelled flowers native to the coast. Then the night came when Vicente observed reddish clouds in the east instead of the west. The stars have lost their brilliance, he told his wife, pointing to the sky. Look at the curious white band on the moon. I've never seen anything like it. Vicente took Valentina and the children to his parents' house before setting out again to get his brother. He brought in the bundles. His father was carrying a gallon of water under each arm. You prepared your house for the hurricane, Vicente? Not yet. What are you waiting for? He went to the kitchen. Angelina called from the kitchen. Vicente, don't stand there all day talking to Valentina. I better go, Vicente said. I don't like to stay in your father's house without you, Valentina said. Why not, when my father likes you best? Vicente teased her. It's safer here. Really, Vicente, I think you're exaggerating the danger. I've never seen that peculiar moon. The moon, the stars, and you. He smiled at her as if he weren't worried. Vicente stopped back at their little house to nail pieces of wood to the windows and doors. He considered locking the pig inside, but better for the pig to brave the wrath of the hurricane than his wife's fury. He drove the pig into the shed. He wished that he had slaughtered it earlier in the summer and invited their neighbors to feast on lechon. They could have celebrated surviving a year of the Americans. He took one last look at the house he had built for Valentina, with its roof sloped in 4 corners in the traditional cuatro aguas style. He rolled past the chicken coop sheltered by mango and citrus trees. The wind blew cool on the back of his neck. He shivered in the sun, disconcerted that he could smell the coffee flowers so far away from the coffee trees. Vicente rode his horse up the rocky slope that curved around the mountain. Even those mountain-born like Vicente had to be cautious of the steep trail. He rode alongside a village of bohíos, built of straw and corn husks, until he reached the hut Raulito shared with his mother. Vicente found Eusebia sitting under the shade of a mango tree, fanning herself with a large leaf. It's you, she said. It's me, he said. I expected you, Eusebia said. This heat is a terrible thing. Vicente took off his hat and wiped his brow with his kerchief. I came to take you to my father's house, Eusebia, you and Raulito. You've always been kind. Eusebia stood to pluck mangoes from the tree. You'll be safer there. Vicente looked at the hut made of plant fiber. She followed his glance, then held out the fruit. It has survived other storms. Here, take these to your mother. Vicente put them in his saddlebags. You won't come? I can't be with those white people, Eusebia said, but I give you thanks. Vicente knew she meant that she couldn't be in the same house with his father. Raulito won't come without you. Make him go, Eusebia said. Vicente found Raulito inside the bohío, adding jaguar rushes to his thatched roof. There was a pile of straw on the floor. I came to take you and Eusebia to Papa's house. Papa's house, Vicente said. I'm staying here, Raulito said. Vicente stared for a moment at his little brother, knowing he wouldn't be able to persuade him. Raulito pointed to the roof. It leaks when there is an aguacero. This one is sure to be un tremendo aguacero at the very least. Did you see the moon? It's going to be a bad one. Raulito packed some straw into the wall. Vicente helped him. Before he left, the brothers hugged each other. When Vicente rode past the rows of bohíos, he saw men carrying palm leaves on plant fiber to prepare their homes for the storm. Women cooked on fogones while their children, the little ones naked, played in the dirt. The children ran alongside his horse, laughing as they raced it. Vicente returned their smiles, wishing he could do more than just wave goodbye. He wasn't a man who prayed, but he mumbled a heartfelt plea for the safety of the people in their straw huts.
Oh, thank you. That's so beautiful. And so much of the story is packed into that section. Can we just take it apart a little bit and talk about it? I want to first talk about the relationship to the brothers. They don't live together. Tell us about that. They're so close, yet their lives are so far apart.
Mm-hmm. Well, one time when Vicente was, I think, like 11 or 12 years old, he had heard rumors that his father had another family or a son or another woman, as men did in those days and still often do. So he went looking up the mountain for this child, and he found Eusebia, Raulito's mother, and also Raulito. He was like 3 or 4 years old, this adorable child. And he just thought, this is my little brother. And from that moment on, he made it his purpose. He didn't think of it that way, but he wanted to be a big brother to Raulito. So he would come and bring him food. When he learned that Raulito didn't know how to read or write and didn't have a teacher, because in those days, unless you had money and you could hire someone to come and teach you, live in your house and teach you, they called them maestro ambulantes, and that meant like a traveling teacher. You would hire them and they would come and live in your house, and maybe all you had to do was give them room and board. But of course, Eusebia, Raulito's mother, and Raulito didn't have that kind of money, and Eusebia couldn't read or write. She was descended from a slave. Her grandfather had been a slave. So he made it his mission to be a helpful older brother, and he taught them both how to read or write. So he had that connection, and Raulito and they have that connection together like brothers. He considers him his brother. Vicente also has an older brother, a few years older, Luisito, that we see in the novel, but this is, I think, his stronger connection. He has almost like a paternal feeling maybe for Raulito, because Raulito doesn't have a father. They share the same biological father, but Raul Vega has nothing to do with Raulito.
I mean, I think it's really interesting, like you said, that Raulito's mother was descendant of enslaved people. I think a lot of people here don't know that there's that history of slave. We know that we have this history of slavery here in the U.S. Well, we'll talk about that too when I say here in the U.S. versus Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is also part of the U.S. But people don't know that there was that history of slavery there.
Oh yeah, the Spaniards. The Spaniards were there. I think anywhere where the Spaniards were, there was slavery probably, right? And they needed the black slaves for the land, and to take out the grass. Coffee doesn't just grow, or sugar doesn't just grow by tossing the seeds. I think from all the research that I did, you have to tear up the land, tear up the grasses.
Yeah, and they needed that free labor.
Yes, you need that labor.
That enslaved labor. Now, when did slavery end in Puerto Rico?
In 1873.
That's after.
After, yes.
After it was over here.
Right. In
Wow,
1873.
I mean, the way you have woven so much history into this compelling story, can you talk to us about your process of researching this, and how did you come to this particular story?
Well, I have always been interested in Puerto Ricans and why they have to leave the island, because my own parents had to leave the island in the 50s to go to the United States to work. So that has always interested me. And I especially am interested in when they don't get to go back. I think of my father, because all he ever wanted was to go back to Puerto Rico, buy a little finca and grow vegetables and have some chickens, but he died young and he was never able to do that. So that I feel for people who can't achieve their dreams of going back to the roots. And when I was doing research on my first novel, I stumbled upon this fact that over 5,000 Puerto Ricans had left Puerto Rico in 1900 to 1903 to go to Hawaii to work
Hawaii?
To work in the sugar plantations. And I'm like, 5,000? I didn't know this. And I called my mother and I'm like, Mommy, did you know? Mommy didn't know. And through this research for this novel, I learned that it was the first major exodus of Puerto Ricans under the American flag to leave the island, kind of like maybe subtly pushed by the US government because there's no employment. And it's much easier to push Puerto Ricans out, like they did for my parents, than to develop jobs, infrastructure, things like that. And so these were things that I learned, and I would call my mother to tell her. And I learned that my mother didn't know any of this history. It was all news to her because although she was an excellent student in Puerto Rico, and she was actually awarded a scholarship to become a teacher in the university, but she didn't take it because she was too poor to even have like the fundamental things that she needed just to attend. She didn't know the history because it's part of Puerto Rico being a colony to erase the history of Puerto Rico and supplant it with American history. Her books were in English. Her teachers were Puerto Ricans, and they taught from these English language books. And what was in it? American history. So in a way, this novel is my reclaiming or claiming my history. And it was also, I was doing it for my mother. Every time I learned something, I would call her up. Even if when I didn't live in the country, I would call her up. At one point, I lived in Zurich for 3 years, and I would call her up and I would say, Mommy, did you know? And she was always so interested.
That's really moving that you were able to give that story back to her.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Did
this
your
is
mother go back?
Yes, my mother, she went back not to live. What was funny is that although my father dreamed about going back and living on a mountain, my mother did not like living on a mountain.
Oh, like
my
your
mother,
characters.
My mother would say it was so dark. There weren't any lights. People talked about the spirits walking around in the mountains, and that terrified her because Puerto Ricans like to tell stories. And I learned, I think I'm an oral, I really learned to write by listening. To my mother tell stories and to Puerto Ricans telling stories. And I think so that is why when I created this novel and the worlds, I needed to have a lot of people. I needed to have a lot of Puerto Ricans in the story because unless you're Puerto Rican, you don't really understand the Puerto Rican culture. How could you? It's not part of your culture. And everybody has a different voice, a different rhythm to the way they talk, as in my family. People interrupt each other all the time. That's a very Puerto Rican thing. And here in the US, people don't like it when you interrupt them. I notice that I do that myself, and I'm trying to bring myself in, but it's like a cultural thing. It's because you're so excited and you want to share what you have to say. But it's like people think it's rude. Why aren't you listening to me? And I sort of started, taking on the American way, like telling my husband, I'm talking. But
well, I felt very, very immersed in the story. I want to talk just a little bit. I know I'm jumping back and forth, but I want to talk about Vincente's family and his mother and his mother's friend, I guess you will say. Can you explain that relationship to us?
Well, I think in Puerto Rico, a lot of things are unspoken. And I felt that people know things, but they gossip about it. Bochinchar, that's what we say. Bochinchar means gossip. They gossip about things, and that's how like Vicente learned about his brother. Nobody told him. He heard it. He heard people talking about it. And here with Angelina, she's very unhappy. She married someone because in those days your choice was if you're a woman, you get married or you stay home, and you are basically an unpaid servant in your family's house, in the house of your sister-in-law or somebody like that. Who wants that, right? So she marries somebody. She has these children, and he's not interested. He's not in love with her either, and he's a philanderer or a mujeriego. That means he has a lot of women. So she's unhappy. What is she going to do? She's on a mountain. You know, there aren't any books, no television. And she doesn't know why. And she's always staring out the window, and she doesn't know why. But one day, Jibaro knocks on her door. That's somebody who works for her husband on the farm. And he says, Doña, Don Raul told me to go clear up his little house up in the mountain. And she's like, his little house on the mountain? What? So she goes with him. And he's like, oh my God, I'm going to be in trouble. But she goes with him, and she discovers that there's this younger woman there who's basically packing up her stuff. And it's her husband's querida, who he doesn't want anymore. So she has to pack up. She's got to get out. And she doesn't have anywhere to live because, again, you don't have family. What are you going to do? What do women always do? You got to eat. So she takes, Angelina is tough and very practical, but she also has a very good heart. And it shows throughout the novel when Jibaros come to her door asking for food, she's always willing to give it. But so she meets Inez, and she brings her back into her house. It causes a revolu, which means like a revolu can be uprising, or else like a big problem. Revolu. Puerto Ricans.
Yes, she takes her husband's ex-girlfriend into the house.
Yes.
But I mean, they're not just, playing Uno.
Well, first it's like, I like to give people their privacy.
No, you don't. I've read this book. But I mean, that's your bedroom, no?
Yes, and I think love is love. And
so I wanted to, but I think love is happening in that bedroom. I mean, you talk about it like they're just over there playing, like I said, playing crazy eights and drinking tea.
I wanted to show that love is love. Love is love. With Raulito too, love is love. Love comes in many forms and celebrate it, embrace it. And so that's what I wanted to show with Inez and Angelina. I wanted to write about something that I haven't really read in novels, and especially novels that are not present day novels, because everything has always happened in the world. So I wanted to write about something that I'm sure happened during that time.
And the rebellion of it, when this is her husband's woman that he's cast off, and then they take up in his house. I love that.
It's sweet. And I feel that, we sometimes have to, I don't want to say stick it to the men, but we have to sometimes,
But I mean, there is no greater subversion than that relationship.
Yes. And Raul deserves it because he's not the kindest or gentlest of men. He has done some really bad things, and he deserves a little bit of something, of being uncomfortable or something.
He gets it. I have to say that their relationship was so intriguing to me in the novel, and I thought I was here for it. I was rooting for them every step of the way.
Yeah, I think they have a really nice relationship because Inez is very softer and her tone is gentler, and she kind of softens a little bit of Angelina's rough edges, I think, especially
A
when it
little,
comes to
a little bit. I
Valentine.
mean, Angelina keeps enough rough edge, in my
Yeah, yeah,
opinion.
yeah.
There's a lot of
Yeah.
edge left over there.
Yeah, like she's a go-between with Valentina and Angelina. And in fact, when Valentina first meets Inez and Angelina, she's confused about the relationship. She doesn't really figure it out till later. She's also kind of naive, but she wishes that Inez was her mother-in-law because she's so nice. You know?
Is very nice. I mean, this book is about a lot of things. It's about colonialism, it's about history, it's about gender, it's about a lot of things, but this is a sexy novel.
Well, I believe in sex. I celebrate sex. And I also think that as a woman writer, I write sex a hell of a lot better than most of the men who I've read that write sex. I'm like, do men even know anything about women when they write about sex? Seriously. It's like the nuts and bolts. We all can figure that out. We know how that works. You know, give me something else. Give me magic. I want magic when I read about sex. And I was trying to, be a magician. So.
Well, I'm saying this. I was reading in public, and I was like, "This is real. I think I need to take this book back to the house." I mean, this book. It's
you need
so
like some cold wine.
It's so intimate.
I'm
gonna say I wouldn't describe it as explicit, but it's very intimate. The way that you know your characters, and you do so while balancing so much research. I know I keep going back to the research, but this book is set over 100 years ago, and you completely immerse us in the details of not only Puerto Rico, but also Hawaii.
Yes, it was a challenge. And I saw it as this huge challenge, kind of like I was wanting to build a cathedral, but in fiction. And so I would okay, today we're going to do I would take it in pieces. And I just really had faith that somehow my ancestors would help me out and would guide me. This novel is kind of a love letter to my ancestors and to my parents who didn't know their history. And I'm sure my grandparents didn't know their history. And it's also a love letter for my children so that they could know their history. And I wanted to be very intentional about what I put in it and the worlds that I created and the people who I created. And I wanted to show how Puerto Ricans are really a lovely people. Of course, we have bad people like everybody else, but we really are a beautiful culture. And I wanted to embrace it. I wanted to celebrate it. And I hope that I did that.
It's amazing that you create this sense of place when you wrote this novel literally all over the world.
Yes, I started writing it when I was in Switzerland. I lived there for 3 years. And so that's when I had already done a lot of research, and I still did research until almost my book was going to be printed, and my editor said, okay, you have to stop. Because every time I found a little detail, I'm like, okay, this is good. I should put it in there. But I would call my mother from Switzerland and tell her the interesting things that I found, and she was always so interested. And one sad thing is that before I came back to the US, I was going to move back. My husband was working in Zurich, and that's why we were living there. And that year, our son was graduating from college. So I knew that a couple big trips were coming back. And my mother was going to celebrate her 80th birthday. And she called me. She said, Marisel, what I want is I would like to go to Puerto Rico, be there for my 80th. See my brothers and my sister, go see all the relatives. And I'm like, Mommy, I can't. It's going to be too hard. And then a couple months later, I found out one of my sisters called me and my mother had cancer. And it was very advanced. And they thought, the doctors didn't really say, but they thought it would just be a few months. And so I talked to my husband and I'm like, we both said, I got to go. So I called her, I said, Mommy, we're going to go to Puerto Rico. One of my sisters, Maria in Chicago, went with my mother, took her to Puerto Rico, and I flew to New York. And from New York, I got a different flight, flew to Puerto Rico. And my uncle, Eddie, who's my mother's brother, Heriberto, he picked us up in San Juan, and he took us up to Utuado, where my family in the book is from. and where my great-grandfather once was a coffee farmer. And that was the first time I was ever in Utuado, because my family's from another part of Puerto Rico where my parents grew up. And it was the first time I was up there. And as soon as I went there, and as soon as he took us to his house up in the mountain, I just felt just of almost physical, but definitely a spiritual connection to Utuado. I'm like, this is it. This is where. And I sort of just ingested all the feelings of being in Utuado, and the lights and the trees and just everything, the smells. And I just knew, I came back with, when I was working on it, just a feel. I could just, you know how it is, Tayari, you're a writer. You got that feel. You're like, I got this. I'm like, I got this. And which was important for me, because I was born in Chicago. I grew up in the Puerto Rican culture, but I was born in Chicago. I didn't go to Puerto Rico until I was 18 years old.
Oh, wow.
Because my parents were poor. There were 6 kids, and we grew up in El Barrio. There was no money for families' vacations to Puerto Rico. And even then, the first time I stepped off the tarmac, in those days in Puerto Rico, you went from the plane, you stepped on the tarmac. It wasn't like inside. I was like, this. I knew. I just felt like, okay, this is where I'm from. I felt it. I have felt it my whole life, even just listening to the stories. It was, maybe I was being primed just to know, this is why I write. This is what you're supposed to do, Let's
talk a little bit about Puerto Rico today. This is a story where the island is devastated by a hurricane. And as we know, I think it was 2017, Hurricane Maria hit. And then the question that was in the air, because the president didn't seem to be quite sure on this, is Puerto Rico, do you feel Puerto Rico is part of the U.S.?
I think the Supreme Court has made that clear, that Puerto Rico belongs to the U.S. It is not part of the U.S. Because there were these cases called insular cases. I think they were written in 1900 or 1901, where Congress wrote this language, this legal language, basically to make Puerto Rico an unincorporated territory. And when you're unincorporated, basically means that you'll never become a state. They don't want you to become a state. Hawaii was different, and Alaska was different. Around the same time, they were also settled by the U.S. Because they were different because they were settled by white settlers, white Americans. So then those could become a state. But Puerto Rico already had too many brown people. They spoke a different language. They had a completely different culture. There were a lot of people. Problem. So, and just recently, the Supreme Court kept promesa, which is the law that President Obama signed, giving this oversight board of 7 or 8 people the right to control the financial assets of Puerto Rico and decide who gets paid. So basically, it's taxation without representation, because Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico cannot vote for president. And isn't that taxation without representation? Isn't that what the, the colony, right? Yeah. The Revolutionary War, so.
Well, before we go to the questions, I just have to ask you one more question, which is, what do you want readers to take away from this book?
I want readers to fall in love with Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, like I love them. And I want them to understand our history. I don't want anyone to ever say, are Puerto Ricans Americans? Although it doesn't really say in that book, because that happened in 1917. But where Puerto Ricans were made conditional citizens, that happened in 1917, not in this time. Yes, Tayari, during this time, Puerto Ricans didn't have any kind of citizenship. Spanish citizenship, nothing. no passport. So
Wow.
there were citizens,
No passport.
nothing. There were citizens of Puerto Rico. The United States even changed the name. Yes. So I would like readers to have a feel for the history, to understand the U.S. invasion of Puerto Rico, to understand how it's a colony, and also to fall in love with the family and fall in love with the people. Fall in love with Valentina and Vicente and Raulito, everybody in the book, and enjoy a good story. I mean,
Well, I have to say to you, I could not put it down. I could not put it down.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to go to the questions. We have some questions from the audience. And if you have questions, you see down at the bottom of the screen where it says ask a question, and I'll read them off. Let me see. This is my first time using this technology. Okay, here's one. I love how you describe your characters with such insight and familiarity. It's clear you spent so much time with them. So I'm going to ask questions not on here. I want you to tell us, how long did it take you to write this book? And are any of the characters inspired by people in your real life?
Well, I've been working on this book for 8 years because I had to do a lot of research in Spanish and English, academic books, journals, all that. Newspapers. I went to a centro in New York City and I looked at microfilm of newspapers from that period in Spanish. And so that's how I learned a lot of interesting things about how the journalists in Puerto Rico thought about Puerto Ricans. And I learned some really interesting things that the Americans did to the Puerto Ricans in the microfilm. But Vicente is named after my father's father, my mother's father, Vicente, my grandfather, who I loved very much. He was a farmer. My family, we still have farmers. My uncles still live on the finca, different fincas in Puerto Rico. My father was a farmer. So in that way, I feel like I'm sort of continuing to write about my family. And I place them in Utuado intentionally because if I have to do all this research, it's just so much more fun for me if I can learn something that I can think, oh, wow, hey, my abuelo Vicente was here during this time and he did this. So this must have been the way Doroteo. I learned that my great-grandfather had 2 families, that was like a family rumor. So that was something that inspired me to have Raulito.
One of the things that I think why in the past, men had all these additional children is that when you think about it, the birth control pill didn't come into wide usage until the early 1970s. So before then, I feel like people find it very easy to believe that people have affairs, but they act shocked when they find out that people have children. And I'm always like, don't you know where babies come from? And so with the idea of passing down property and family name, then some children were in line to receive property and were acknowledged, and other children were not.
Yeah. And men just did whatever they wanted, And in the Puerto Rican culture, even now, a lot of men do whatever they want. So not good. But did you say the 1970s, Tayari?
Yeah, the birth control bill was like 1972. We barely made it. I was born in 1970.
Because
I snuck under the line.
In another conversation, I want to talk about how the U.S. government used Puerto Rican women to implement and test their birth control policies. So that's another conversation that we could have. Yes, that is the truth. And that started in the 1930s in Puerto Rico.
It seems like the relationship of the United States with Puerto Rico is far more complex, and it seems to be vastly understudied.
Yes, I think so. It's very complex. There are a lot of historians who are writing about it. And I am sure that there are a lot of great Puerto Rican writers who are writing about a lot of stories similar to mine in Spanish. But I think that's what might make mine a little different, is that it's in the English language.
That brings us here. Someone asked you, are there Latina writers who have inspired you particularly, especially at the beginning of your writing life?
Well, Cristina Garcia, definitely. I love her. And let's see.
You took a class from her, didn't you?
Yes. In fact, yes, Tayari. I took a class from her. Tayari and I met
In that class.
Yes, 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 yes. So I think Cristina Garcia is like a goddess. But one book that really she's not it's a Puerto Rican writer. In the 1960s, there was this book called Down These Mean Streets by Petey Thomas. He was New Yorican. He was Black Puerto Rican. I read him when I was a teenager in the 70s. I was a huge bookworm. I never saw myself in books, so I never, ever thought that I could be a novelist until I read Cristina Garcia. And I thought, maybe I could do that. I knew I was a writer, but I didn't know that I could do that. But getting back to Down These Mean Streets, it really made a big impression on me. He wrote about colorism, about the racial prejudice that he felt living in New York as a Black Puerto Rican, and also as a Black man in his family. He and his father were Black Puerto Ricans. Everybody else was a white Puerto Rican in the family. And he wrote about that. And maybe I think that sort of informed me. I was young, 16, and it helped me to see and understand the world in a different way. And I saw that also in my family with these little microaggressions that the family makes, like, about hair or about skin color. And, there are a lot of little phrases that Puerto Ricans use, although Puerto Ricans, many of them say there's no racial prejudice. Now, a lot of people are admitting that there is.
Well, what they say, nothing can be solved until it is faced.
Yes.
Now, I want to just get back. When we met, it was 20 years ago, and we were taking a class at the writing workshop called VONA. And that's been 20 years. 20 years. It's like our anniversary. We should have some champagne or something.
Let's go back to Italy. We were in Italy together last year.
When I saw Marisel in Italy, she did not tell me that she had to go back to her hotel to finish the edits on her book.
Right. I was at the hotel bar every night working because my editor was tough. She's like, it has to be done by this time. So, I mean, I
was at my hotel bar too, but I wasn't working. I wasn't doing
I was
any
working. Yeah, I was like, and it was a heat wave, Tayari.
It was so hot. It was. Yeah. Tell me about this. Tell us about your journey. And the reason I'm asking you about your journey in these 20 years is that I know there are a lot of people who have a story to tell, and they don't know the way forward. I do think we have way over publicized the narrative of a young person gets out of college, goes to elite MFA, and then like an agent gives them a tackle hug, and that's the end of the story. Tell us your story.
No. Well, I don't have an MFA. I just have a BA. I was a journalism major. And when I got out of college, no jobs. Reagan was in office. And I had to go back to the job that I had done when I was in high school. You don't know how that was so terrible. Because here I had loans, and I had to go back to the job that I had when, bad. So I grew up in Humboldt Park, and I'm proud of that. And that's El Barrio, one of the barrios in Chicago. El Barrio, where a lot of Puerto Ricans are. Public school girl, and didn't learn a lot, I think. I learned through books, through literature. I was just totally in love with literature from the moment I read when I was 8 years old. And then when I was 13 or 14 years old, I had an English class. That's when I wrote my first short story. And something happened when I was that age that gave me my purpose as a writer. And that was this neighborhood in Chicago called Pilsen, where a lot of Mexican immigrants lived. There was a series of arsons, and the landlords, white landlords, paid arsonists to set the buildings on fire while the families were asleep so that they could collect the insurance money. And when the firemen came, because at that time there weren't firefighters, they were just firemen, none of them spoke English because they hadn't changed that rule. But they heard people shouting, ayuda, fuego, that means help, fire, and they didn't understand, and they didn't go to those voices. Why wouldn't you go to those voices?
Right. Even if you didn't know exactly what they're
Why?
saying.
So some people died. And in the Chicago newspapers, they blamed the victims. People wrote letters to the editors. I was a big newspaper reader. My father taught himself to read English through the English newspapers. So we got them every day. And I read the letters to the editors. And a lot of people blame the victims, saying, they're in this country, why don't they learn English? And a newscaster on TV, I don't remember who it was, because I would be saying his name right now if I remembered, said the same thing, blamed the victims. And so here I am, 13, 14 years old, just realized that I could write, because you know that feeling of love, rush of love that you feel when you figure, hey, I think this is for me. And I thought, one day I'm going to write in English for people whose language is not English, so that people could see us as people, as part of humanity. Like, who cares if we don't speak English? We're people. So that was something that I always had. And I got into journalism, and I got into PR because that was a job I could get. Things were hard for people like me who don't have connections. But one thing that really made me be a writer and to try fiction is when I had my daughter. When I had my daughter, there was just something that just like, I just thought, I'm going to try. Something just changed. Just having my daughter just changed my thinking. And then Christina Garcia's book soon after came in front of me. And later on, I saw
Dreaming in Cuban.
Yes, and then I saw Julia Alvarez, The Time of the Butterflies, which I also love. And I'm like, I'm going to try. They could do it. I'm going to try. You know, I'm here this far. I'm not meant to have gotten as far as I did because I was, you know, affirmative action kid. But I'm going to try. And so and let me tell you, I lucked out having an agent who believed in me, who rejected every time I sent her a version of anything I wrote, but pushed me to do better. But it was not easy for her to sell either one of my novels. If I don't like to say, if I had not been Puerto Rican, maybe she would have sold it better, but I feel that's true. Easier. I think so. Because come on.
You know, I'm not going to fight you on that.
It was tough. It was tough. And it is tough. But we can't give up, I think.
Okay, I have a couple more questions in here for you. Okay. We're running out of time. So I hope that when we're done, you look at these things. But I feel you've already answered the question about your research, but I want to read the kind comment that preceded it.
Yeah.
It says, thank you for this love letter to your family and for sharing it with us. I cannot wait to savor your words and dive into the story.
Thank you.
So I thought that was quite lovely. Someone wants to know, how did you come up with this title?
Titles are very, very difficult for me, but this one just came.
Really?
This one just came, yes. But you know what's also hard? Names. The names, because I have so many characters. So naming all these characters, it's a challenge.
Now, here's my last question for you for the evening is this. And before I ask it, I want to say, everyone, you see the link down at the bottom that says purchase The Taste of Sugar here. Please purchase from your local independent bookstore. Books and Books has made this possible, and we would like you to buy the book from them. But my questions for you is, what advice do you have for someone who's out there trying? I'm not really terribly interested in advice about publishing. I feel publishing is the least interesting part of what we do. But someone who has a story and a pen, what advice would you give them to help them keep going?
I think you have to write because you love it and because you have something to say and you think nobody else can say it. You just have to tell your own story and you have to believe that your story is important. That's what I think. That's what I advise you. Only you can tell your story. Don't give up. Don't listen to the inner critic. Just write it and rewrite it. I'm a big rewriter.
She is an incredible rewriter. Every word in this book, you can tell that she picked this particular word and put it next to this other word, so that, I mean, the artistry, your artistry in this book, I knew you've been working on it a long time, but when I read it, I was like, oh yeah, oh yes. Just the letters between them and the emotion and just the landing. I won't spoil anything, but when I finished this book, I just hugged it like this, like, oh yes. So congratulations on this book.
Thank you,
I am
Tayari.
delighted, and I'm just so eager to see all the places it'll take you. This is The Taste of Sugar by Marisel Vera. Thank you for having this conversation with me, and thank you to all of you for tuning in.
Thank you, Tayari.
The pleasure is all mine.